Have you ever worked for a boss who makes your life miserable with pointless tasks and constant criticism? What happens when the pressure gets too much and you decide to fight back? Today's story dives deep into the harsh reality of toxic leadership and the courage it takes to stand up against it. If you've ever felt trapped under a bad boss, this one's for you. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story that speaks to your soul. Mark sat in his cubicle, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead blending with the low chatter of his coworkers. The office smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer toner. It was Tuesday morning, just past 9 a.m., and the usual routine had already begun, emails stacking up, meetings lined on his calendar, and the constant pressure to meet deadlines. Mark was 30, a reliable middle-tier employee at Hammond & Company, a mid-sized marketing firm in a quiet part of town. He'd been here for 6 years, carving out a steady rhythm in his daily work life. Not glamorous, but dependable. Enough to pay rent, cover his car, and sometimes catch a movie on the weekend. But today was different. Today, a new CEO was arriving. Rumors had been swirling for weeks about changes coming from the top floor, changes that many feared but no one could quite pin down. Mark had heard whispers in the break room, new management, restructuring, efficiency initiatives. But until now, nothing concrete. Just before 10 a.m., a wave of anticipation washed over the office as the elevator doors opened and the new CEO stepped out. James? Tall, with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze. His presence filled the room like a storm rolling in. Mark noticed the way people straightened up, the polite smiles turning into cautious nods. James moved quickly, surveying the workspace with an intensity that felt almost like judgment. He didn't smile. Not once. Instead, he called an all-hands meeting in the conference room. Everyone was expected. Mark took his seat near the back, trying not to stand out. The room buzzed with nervous energy. James cleared his throat and began. "I'm James Carter," he said, voice firm and commanding. "I'm here to take Hammond & Company to the next level. We're going to implement new policies. We're going to work harder, smarter. There will be changes." He paused, letting that hang in the air. Some of the old ways are no longer acceptable. Inefficiency, slackers, distractions, they end now. Mark felt a chill. He looked around and saw similar expressions on faces, some hopeful, some worried. James continued, outlining a long list of new rules: no personal phone use at desks, stricter deadlines, daily progress reports, mandatory overtime on some projects. The tone was harsh, uncompromising. Mark wondered how realistic these demands were. The company was already stretched thin. His team barely kept up as it was. But no one dared say a word. After the meeting, Mark returned to his desk, trying to focus on his first assignment under the new regime. His manager, Lisa, dropped a thick folder on his keyboard. "James wants daily check-ins. Starting tomorrow. You'll have to report what you did every hour." Mark blinked. "Every hour? That was insane." Lisa shrugged. "It's his way. We have to follow." That afternoon, Mark noticed James walking through the rows of desks, stopping at random spots, inspecting monitors, scrutinizing calendars. When James reached Mark's desk, he leaned over and said in a low voice, "I want results. No excuses." Mark nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. The next few days were a blur. Mark's calendar filled with overlapping meetings. Tasks piled up, many pointless. James assigned him to organize files no one used, create reports no one read, and answer emails flagged as urgent that were mostly spam. Mark worked late. He skipped lunch. He barely slept. One morning, after barely closing his eyes, Mark received a new email from James with a priority label. "Revise the client proposal by noon. And make sure every slide includes data charts." "I don't want fluff." Mark groaned. The original proposal was already done. He texted Lisa, "Is this really necessary?" She replied, "James wants it." "No choice." Mark sighed, opening the file again. At a team meeting, James criticized Mark's last report as sloppy and uninspired in front of everyone. Mark felt his face flush. He wanted to speak up, defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. His coworker Tom gave him a quick, sympathetic glance but said nothing. Days turned into weeks. The pressure mounted. James introduced more efficiency rules, time-tracking apps, mandatory weekend check-ins, dress code enforcement. Mark felt trapped in a tightening vice. The office, once a place of routine, became a battleground. One evening, Mark stayed late to finish a presentation. The office emptied until he was alone, except for James, who appeared suddenly. "You're still here," James said coldly. "Good. I need those extra slides by tomorrow morning." Mark nodded, swallowing back frustration. James's eyes narrowed. "Remember, Mark, I'm watching." Mark stared at the screen, hands trembling slightly. He realized this wasn't about work anymore. It was control. The next morning, Mark arrived at the office feeling drained but determined. He needed to prove himself, even if the new CEO's demands seemed impossible. He set his coffee on the desk, booted up his computer, and opened the folder James had sent him last night. Hours blurred as Mark stared at spreadsheets and client data, reworking slides to include more charts and metrics, as James insisted. Every few minutes, Mark glanced at the clock, knowing the deadline was tight. At 11:30 a.m., Lisa came over to his desk. "Mark, James wants to see you in his office." "Now," she said, eyes wary. Mark's heart sank. He closed his laptop and walked down the hall, the walls suddenly feeling narrower, the air heavier. James's office was sleek and cold, with a large glass window overlooking the city. James sat behind his polished desk, fingers steepled. "Sit down," James said without looking up. Mark obeyed, clutching his folder. James flipped through the pages, nodding slowly, then stopped. "The data is adequate. But where's the creativity? The spark? I don't want numbers alone, I want strategy, innovation. This is marketing, not accounting." Mark bit back a retort. "I thought you said you wanted more data in the slides." James's eyes flashed. "I want both. You're either adaptable or you're not. I expect better." Mark left the office with a knot in his stomach. Back at his desk, the pressure was relentless. James had already scheduled an impromptu brainstorming session in an hour. Mark barely had time to prepare before the conference room filled with his team and James at the head. "All right, people," James began. "We're losing clients because we're stuck in the past. I want fresh ideas. Everyone contribute. No excuses." Lisa looked nervous. Mark felt the weight of all eyes on him. James pointed at Mark. "You first." Mark cleared his throat, hesitating. "Well, maybe we could try a more personalized campaign targeting younger audiences using social media influencers?" James snorted. "Cliché. Heard it 100 times. Be original." A few others threw out suggestions, some decent, some weak. James dismissed most with a sharp word or a glare. The meeting dragged on, James driving the team harder, pushing for ideas that matched his vision but never quite satisfied him. By the time it ended, Mark felt exhausted, almost defeated. That afternoon, Mark's phone buzzed. It was a text from James, "New task. Review competitor ads and summarize key strategies by 5 p.m. Mark groaned inwardly. It felt like busy work, but he had no choice. He stayed late again, eyes burning as he scrolled through dozens of ads, taking notes and trying to spot patterns. On his way home, Mark's mind raced. Was this what his career had come to? Endless pointless tasks under a micromanaging boss who undermined him at every turn? He thought of his weekends, once free to relax or meet friends, now swallowed by work emails and stress. Mark's phone pinged again, a calendar reminder for tomorrow's progress check-in with James. He exhaled deeply. The next morning, the check-in felt like an interrogation. James grilled Mark on every detail, what he'd done, what he planned, why certain deadlines were missed. Mark answered as best he could but sensed James's growing impatience. "You're slow," James said finally. "I expected more by now. You need to step up." Mark nodded silently. After the meeting, Lisa pulled Mark aside. "James is tough," she said quietly. "I know it's hard. Just keep your head down and do what he asks." Mark appreciated the sympathy but felt more isolated than ever. Days passed and James's demands intensified. One afternoon, James summoned Mark to help organize a last-minute corporate event. The task seemed straightforward but quickly spiraled into chaos. Vendors canceled, budgets clashed, schedules shifted. Mark scrambled to fix every problem, working late into the night. When he finally collapsed into bed, exhaustion overwhelmed him. But the next morning brought no relief. James called him into the office again. "This event is a disaster," James barked. "You're incompetent." Mark tried to explain the issues but was cut off. James's words stung deeply. For the first time, Mark felt tears prick his eyes. He swallowed the pain, unwilling to show weakness. That evening, Mark confided in his friend Amy over the phone. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," he said. "James is impossible. Every day feels worse." Amy listened patiently. "You're not alone," she said softly. "Maybe you should start documenting everything. Keep track of his unreasonable demands and how they affect your work." Mark nodded slowly. "Maybe," he said. "I just want this nightmare to end." The days that followed were a blur of tension and exhaustion. Mark felt like he was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. James's expectations grew more impossible by the hour and his criticisms sharper. One morning, Mark arrived to find a new email from James in his inbox. The subject line read, "Revise all current projects, priority, urgent." No further explanation. Mark sighed and opened the message, which contained only a list of vague and conflicting demands. As he sat at his desk, trying to parse the priorities, Lisa stopped by. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low. Mark shook his head. "I don't even know where to start. Every time I fix one thing, James finds another problem." Lisa glanced nervously toward James's office. "He's got a way of breaking people down. I've seen it before." Mark rubbed his temples. "I don't want to be broken." She gave him a small, encouraging smile. "You're not alone. And maybe it's time you take Amy's advice." Mark nodded. That afternoon, he began compiling a detailed log. Every unreasonable task, every impossible deadline, every unfair criticism. He saved emails, recorded times, and noted who was involved. But the strain was taking its toll. Mark's sleep became restless, his appetite disappeared. His usual sharpness dulled. At a team meeting, James singled him out again. "Mark, your numbers are slipping. What's going on?" Mark swallowed. "I'm doing my best, James. The new projects are complicated and the timeline is tight." James's eyes narrowed. "Your best isn't good enough. I need results, not excuses." Mark's jaw clenched. He bit back a retort and forced himself to nod. After the meeting, Lisa caught up with him again. "You can't keep going like this," she said. "You need to find a way to push back carefully." Mark shook his head. "If I push back, he'll just come down harder." Lisa looked thoughtful. "True. But maybe there's a way to protect yourself. Like documenting everything, showing HR if it gets worse." Mark's stomach twisted. HR in this company was known to side with management. Still, he knew he needed a backup plan. The pressure at work became relentless. One afternoon, James assigned Mark a new project: overhaul the company's client retention strategy. The catch? The deadline was just 3 days. Mark stayed late, working through every detail, trying to think creatively despite the exhaustion. The night before the deadline, his phone buzzed with a message from James: "Meeting at 7 a.m. to review your progress." Mark stared at the screen, disbelief washing over him. 7 in the morning? He barely had time to sleep. That night, he managed only a few hours of restless sleep before his alarm dragged him awake. At the office, James was waiting, looking impatient. "Let's see what you've got," James said sharply. Mark presented his ideas, detailing every angle he had considered. James listened, then shook his head. "Not innovative enough. Too safe. I expect you to think bigger." Mark felt his chest tighten. "Can you be more specific?" he asked. James smirked. "Figure it out. That's your job." The meeting ended with no clear direction, just more pressure. Mark walked back to his desk, defeated. Later, Lisa stopped by with a folder. "I found this in the break room," she said. "Someone left it out. It's a complaint form for employee grievances. Maybe it's time to use it." Mark looked down at the papers. The idea of formally complaining scared him, but staying silent was unbearable. That evening, Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring at the blank complaint form. What if this made things worse? What if James found out? His phone buzzed again. It was Amy. "Hey, how's work?" she asked. Mark sighed. "The same. I'm thinking about filing a complaint, but I'm scared." Amy's voice was firm. "You have every right to stand up for yourself. No one should treat you like this." Mark took a deep breath. Maybe it was time to stop just surviving and start fighting back. The next morning, Mark walked into the office with a new kind of determination. He had spent the night filling out the complaint form, detailing every unreasonable demand, every humiliating comment, every moment James had pushed him beyond what felt humanly possible. Still, doubt gnawed at him. What if he was making a mistake? What if James found out and made his life worse? But the alternative, continuing to crumble under the weight of impossible expectations, felt unbearable. Mark headed to HR, a small, windowless room at the end of a dim hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly as he entered. "Hi, I'd like to file a complaint," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. The HR representative, a middle-aged woman named Karen, glanced up with mild curiosity. "About what?" she asked, flipping through some papers. Mark took a deep breath and laid out his case, handing over the detailed log he had kept. Karen nodded slowly, jotting down notes. "I see. We'll review this and follow up." "Will James know?" Mark asked quietly. Karen looked up, her face unreadable. "We handle these matters confidentially. But sometimes the subject of a complaint becomes aware." Mark nodded, heart pounding. "Okay. Thank you." As he left the room, Mark felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He had taken a step, but the road ahead was uncertain. Back at his desk, whispers circled almost immediately. Word traveled fast, and James's behavior grew colder, more hostile. At lunch, Lisa slid into the seat across from him. "People know," she said quietly. "And James isn't happy." Mark stared at his plate. I expected that. Lisa leaned in. You have to be careful. He's watching you. That afternoon, Mark's inbox was flooded with emails from James, last-minute changes, impossible demands, and subtle threats disguised as advice. One message read, "If you can't keep up, maybe this isn't the right place for you." Mark felt the familiar tightening in his chest but pushed it down. He wasn't going anywhere. That evening, Mark met Amy at a nearby coffee shop. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Barely," Mark admitted. "It's like walking through fire every day." Amy reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You're stronger than you think. Keep records, keep friends close, and don't let him isolate you." Mark nodded, grateful. "I just want to do my job and be respected." Amy smiled sadly. "You deserve that. And don't forget you're not alone." Over the next week, the tension escalated. James's micromanagement became relentless. Mark's work was scrutinized to the smallest detail. Colleagues who once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact, wary of getting caught in the crossfire. One afternoon, Mark overheard James mocking him to a group of managers. "Mark's got potential," James said with a sneer, "if only he weren't so slow and resistant to change." Mark's face flushed with anger and humiliation. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, Mark wondered how much more he could take. But then he remembered the log he kept, the evidence, the support of Lisa and Amy, and his own quiet strength. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for respect, for dignity, and for the hope that work didn't have to be a daily nightmare. The next morning, Mark arrived early and printed copies of his complaint and supporting documents. He slid them into a folder and prepared to meet with Karen again. Before the meeting, James unexpectedly appeared at Mark's desk. "Mark," James said, his tone deceptively calm, "I hear you've been stirring things up." Mark met his gaze steadily. "I'm standing up for myself." James smiled coldly. "Careful. That kind of attitude can get you in trouble here." Mark didn't flinch. "I'm ready to face that." James turned and walked away, leaving Mark with a mix of fear and defiance. In the HR office, Karen reviewed the documents and promised to start an investigation. Days passed, each heavier than the last. James's hostility didn't abate, but Mark found solace in small victories, supportive words from colleagues, moments of quiet resilience. One afternoon, Karen called Mark into her office. "We've spoken with James and several team members," she said. "There's enough here to address the situation." Mark felt a spark of hope. "We're setting up mediation sessions and will monitor the work environment closely. If you experience retaliation, report it immediately." Mark nodded, feeling the weight begin to lift just slightly. Walking back to his desk, he caught Lisa's eye. She smiled faintly. "You're doing the right thing," she said. Mark looked out the window, thinking about the long road ahead. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of control. The days following the HR meeting were some of the hardest Mark had faced in years. Even though an official investigation was underway, James's behavior didn't soften. Instead, it turned sharper, more calculated. Every email, every meeting felt like a test of endurance. On Monday morning, Mark found a new task waiting in his inbox, an absurdly detailed report due by the end of the day, requiring data that wasn't yet available. The request was clearly designed to set him up for failure. He sighed, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. As he navigated the labyrinth of incomplete files and uncooperative coworkers, Mark's phone buzzed with a message from Lisa. "Lunch? Need to talk." He felt a small spark of relief. Lisa was one of the few people who still believed in him. In the cramped break room, Lisa looked serious. "Mark, have you thought about how you'll handle this if it keeps escalating?" she asked. Mark shook his head. "I'm trying to hold on, but some days it feels impossible." Lisa leaned forward. "You need allies. Document everything, keep your support close, and remember you're not alone in this." Her words gave him a fragile hope. Back at his desk, Mark focused on the report. Hours later, when he finally hit send, his chest tightened with anticipation. He knew James would scrutinize every detail. At 3 p.m., James appeared by Mark's desk unannounced. "Let me see what you've got," he said, leaning over. Mark handed him the laptop cautiously. James scrolled through the report, frowning exaggeratedly. "This is inadequate," he said finally. "You missed several key points. Looks like you don't understand the project." Mark forced calm. "I followed the guidelines and used the data available." James smirked. "Guidelines change, Mark? Maybe you need to pay more attention." Mark felt the familiar burn of frustration. But instead of arguing, he nodded. "I'll revise it." James left, but the damage was done. Later that day, Mark overheard whispers by the water cooler. "Did you see James tearing into Mark?" "Yeah, feels like he's got it out for him." Mark's stomach twisted. The isolation was growing. At home, Mark called Amy. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," he admitted. Amy's voice was steady. Remember why you started this. You're fighting for your dignity. And that's worth every battle. Mark closed his eyes, drawing strength from her words. The following week, HR called Mark in for a check-in. James has been notified about the complaint, Karen said. We're monitoring the situation closely. Please report any retaliation. Mark nodded, feeling the heavy weight of scrutiny. That afternoon, James assigned Mark to assist with a last-minute project alongside a new team member, Brian, a younger employee known for being overly competitive. Brian immediately began criticizing Mark's work, pointing out mistakes in front of the whole team. Maybe this isn't your pace, Mark, Brian sneered. Mark bit back a retort, focusing instead on keeping calm. After the meeting, Brian approached him. Why don't you just quit? No one's going to miss you here, he said quietly. Mark stared, shocked. Why would you say that? Brian shrugged. Just being honest. Mark's heart sank. This was more than just James's bullying, it was spreading. He called Lisa again. They're turning everyone against me, he said. Lisa's tone was fierce. Don't let them win. Keep fighting. One evening, Mark stayed late at the office, reviewing reports and emails. Exhaustion clawed at him, but he refused to give up. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with an anonymous message, drop the complaint or things will get worse. Mark's hands trembled. He stared at the screen, torn between fear and resolve. The next morning, he told Lisa. She frowned. We have to tell HR. This is serious. Mark agreed. In the HR office, Karen listened carefully as Mark showed the message. This is harassment, she said firmly. We'll increase protection measures. Mark felt a glimmer of safety but knew the battle was far from over. Days later, during a team meeting, James publicly questioned Mark's commitment and competence, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Mark held his ground, responding with facts and calm. The room was silent, colleagues exchanging uneasy glances. Afterwards, Lisa whispered, that was brave. Mark nodded, exhaustion mixed with quiet pride. As the investigation progressed, small changes emerged. James was reprimanded behind closed doors, warnings were issued. Mark's workload became more manageable and some colleagues began reaching out again. One afternoon, Amy surprised him with lunch. How are you feeling? She asked. Stronger, Mark admitted. I'm learning to stand up even when it feels impossible. Amy smiled. That's the spirit. Mark looked out the window, the city alive with possibility. He knew the road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in months, he felt hope stirring inside. The atmosphere at the office shifted slowly but surely. Though the tension never fully lifted, some of Mark's co-workers started to show subtle signs of solidarity. It wasn't much, a nod in the hallway, a quiet word of encouragement, but it meant the world to him. James, however, seemed undeterred. If anything, his tone grew colder, his expectations more absurd. Mark found himself caught in a relentless cycle of demands and criticism. One afternoon, James called him into his office for what felt like the 100th time. Mark, I need these projections by tomorrow morning. And don't come to me with excuses this time, James said, tapping his pen impatiently on the desk. Mark nodded silently. He knew that pushing back would only make things worse. On his way out, Mark passed Brian, the young team member who had openly mocked him. Brian smirked and whispered, better hurry or you'll miss the deadline again. Mark forced a smile but felt his chest tighten. That night, Mark sat at his kitchen table, the cold glow of his laptop screen casting shadows across his tired face. Amy was in the next room, and though they lived together, the isolation he felt was deep. He glanced at the stack of emails, revisions, urgent requests, passive-aggressive comments. Each one felt like a fresh cut. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Lisa, coffee tomorrow? I have some ideas. Mark smiled for the first time that day. The next morning, at their usual cafe, Lisa laid out a plan. We need to build a network, not just with HR, but higher up, and document everything meticulously. Also, maybe consider getting a legal consultation. Mark sighed. I didn't want to go that far. Lisa's eyes were steady. Sometimes it's the only way. Over the following weeks, Mark followed her advice. He gathered every email, recorded meetings, and kept a detailed journal of every incident. At work, James's behavior oscillated unpredictably. Some days he was barely civil, others outright hostile. During one team meeting, James snapped at Mark for a minor typo in a presentation. You're careless. Do you even care about your job? He said, loud enough for the room to hear. Mark's face flushed. I'll fix it immediately, he replied, voice steady. Afterwards, several colleagues lingered around, offering quiet support. One of them, Sarah from accounting, pulled him aside. I'm sorry you're dealing with this. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Mark nodded, grateful. But the toll was real. He started having trouble sleeping, the stress gnawing at his nerves. Sometimes he woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing. Amy noticed the change and urged him to take breaks, to rest more. I want to help, but I don't know how, she admitted one evening. Mark appreciated her honesty. Just being here helps. At the office, the anonymous threats ceased after HR intensified security measures, but the subtle hostility remained. One day, Mark found his work sabotaged, data files missing or corrupted. He suspected Brian but couldn't prove it. Feeling cornered, Mark confided in Lisa. They're trying to break you, she said firmly. Don't let them. Mark clenched his fists. He was exhausted, but he refused to be beaten. Weeks later, HR called him for a follow-up. Karen informed him that James was under serious review. Your complaint triggered a full audit of his management style, Karen said. We're considering disciplinary actions. Mark allowed himself a small smile. But the battle wasn't over. During a quarterly meeting, James delivered a stinging critique of the entire department, indirectly blaming Mark for missed targets. Mark stood his ground, calmly addressing the points with facts. The room was tense, but some managers nodded approvingly. After the meeting, one senior executive pulled Mark aside. I've been watching your work, she said quietly. Don't let anyone undermine your efforts. You have potential. Mark felt a flicker of hope. That night, he texted Amy. I'm not giving up. This fight is mine to win. Amy replied instantly. And I'm with you. Mark realized that despite the chaos and pain, he was no longer alone. The following weeks were a whirlwind for Mark. With every small victory came a new challenge. James didn't take kindly to the fact that HR was now watching his every move. His tone grew even colder, his criticisms sharper. Meetings turned into confrontations, and Mark often found himself walking a tightrope, careful not to give James any ammunition but refusing to back down. One afternoon, Mark arrived early to prepare for an important presentation to the board. As he set up his laptop, a sticky note caught his eye, stuck to the edge of his keyboard. You're replaceable. The message was anonymous, but Mark knew exactly who it was from. He took a deep breath, peeling the note off and crumpling it into his pocket. The presentation itself was a test. Mark had poured hours into crafting his report, outlining new strategies and opportunities for growth. As he spoke, he noticed some board members nodding along, interested and engaged. But when James got the floor, he subtly undercut Mark's points, casting doubt on the feasibility of the proposals. Mark felt a surge of frustration but kept his composure. After the meeting, Lisa approached him quietly. You did well, she said. Don't let him steal your thunder. Mark smiled weakly. Easier said than done. That evening, Mark sat with Amy, telling her about the meeting. I'm proud of you, she said. But I hate seeing you like this. He nodded. It's wearing me down. Amy reached out, holding his hand. We'll get through it. Together. The next day brought an unexpected turn. Karen from HR called Mark into her office again, this time with a more serious expression. We've completed a preliminary investigation, she began. Several employees have come forward with concerns about James's behavior. Mark felt a flicker of hope. We're preparing a formal warning. But I have to warn you, this may get messy. Mark swallowed hard. He knew it would. Over the next days, James's hostility turned more overt. He started assigning Mark impossible deadlines, often calling him into meetings that ended with vague threats about his performance. One afternoon, Mark found a file on his desk, a copy of an anonymous complaint that someone had made against him, alleging poor work ethic and unprofessionalism. Mark's heart sank. He realized the office politics were more poisonous than he'd imagined. Still, he refused to give in. In his private journal, he wrote, "This isn't just about me. It's about standing up when things aren't right." Lisa suggested organizing a small support group among the staff who had witnessed James's behavior. They met discreetly after hours, sharing stories and gathering strength. Together, we're louder, Lisa said. Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. But the toll was visible. His sleep was restless. He had lost weight. Amy worried about him constantly. One night, Amy found him staring blankly at the ceiling. Talk to me, she whispered. Mark hesitated, then opened up about his fears, losing the job, the constant battle, the weariness. Amy held him close. You're stronger than you think. Days later, the company announced an external audit of management practices. James was placed on probation pending the results. Mark dared to hope. Yet, as one door opened, another closed. Brian's sabotage escalated. Files were deleted, emails intercepted. Mark's credibility was under attack from all sides. One afternoon, Mark confronted Brian quietly in the hallway. This has to stop, he said firmly. Brian sneered. What are you going to do? Cry to HR. Mark shook his head. No. I'm going to keep working and make sure the truth comes out. That evening, Mark received a message from the senior executive who had praised him. "Keep your head up. I'm watching." Mark smiled for the first time in weeks, feeling like he wasn't alone in the fight. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest Mark had ever faced. The external audit was underway and whispers about James's behavior had begun to circulate more openly. Yet, the atmosphere in the office remained tense, like walking through a minefield. Mark's daily routine had become a balancing act. He kept producing quality work even as he battled invisible forces trying to trip him up. Every time a report he had worked on was questioned or delayed, it felt personal. One morning, Mark arrived to find a note taped to his office door, "You won't last." The handwriting was unmistakable. He crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash, but the sting lingered. Lisa came by later, sensing his mood. "You're not alone, Mark," she said softly. "We have your back." Her words meant more than she could know. That afternoon, Mark got a call from HR. They wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss the audit and some concerns raised by employees. He felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The meeting room was quiet except for Karen and two other HR representatives. They listened carefully as Mark detailed everything: the unreasonable demands, the threats, the sabotage, and the toxic atmosphere. Karen nodded. "We're taking these seriously." Mark hoped this would mark a turning point. But change was slow. James's probation was official, but he still wielded influence. Some colleagues remained loyal to him, others stayed silent out of fear. Mark's friendships deepened with those who stood by him. Lisa became a constant source of encouragement, often checking in with a text or coffee. One evening, Amy surprised Mark with dinner at home. "You need to recharge," she said. Mark smiled tiredly. "I don't want to give up." Amy reached out, squeezing his hand. "And you won't." As the audit progressed, HR called more employees to speak. Slowly, the truth started surfacing: stories of James's unreasonable demands, his favoritism, and the way he bullied those who challenged him. Mark felt vindicated, but the emotional toll was undeniable. He struggled to shake off anxiety that clung to him like a shadow. One morning, after a sleepless night, Mark found a message on his desk from James. "This isn't over." Mark folded the note carefully, anger flaring. He wasn't going to let James intimidate him anymore. At work, Mark focused on his projects, letting his results speak. His professionalism and resilience didn't go unnoticed by the higher-ups. Then came the news everyone was waiting for: the audit report. Karen called Mark into her office, holding a thick folder. "We have recommendations for disciplinary action against James," she said firmly. "He'll be suspended pending further review." Mark felt a wave of relief and exhaustion. Outside, Lisa was waiting. They shared a quiet smile, a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. That night, Mark and Amy talked for hours. "This isn't the end," Mark said. "But maybe it's a fresh start." Amy hugged him tightly. "You've earned that." As Mark prepared to return to work the next day, he realized how much he had grown: tougher, wiser, and more determined. The fight was far from over, but he was ready. Mark woke up the next morning feeling a cautious optimism he hadn't felt in weeks. The news of James's suspension spread quickly through the office, stirring a mix of relief and curiosity. Some coworkers whispered behind closed doors, others gave Mark approving nods in the hallway. But Mark knew better than to let his guard down. The toxic shadow James had cast didn't vanish overnight. Mark arrived at work early, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The office felt quieter, lighter, but still fragile. His first meeting of the day was with Karen. She handed him a thick stack of documents, the findings from the audit detailing James's violations, abuses of power, and unprofessional conduct. "This is just the beginning," Karen said. "The company is reviewing everything, including how to prevent this from happening again." Mark nodded. "Thank you for taking this seriously." Karen smiled faintly. "You did the right thing by speaking up. It's not easy." Later, Mark received a message from Lisa, checking in. "How are you holding up?" He replied quickly. "Better. Still shaken, but hopeful." They met for lunch in the cafeteria, talking quietly about the future. "I'm proud of you," Lisa said. "You stood your ground." Mark forced a smile. "Couldn't have done it without you." The afternoon brought new challenges. James's loyalists had begun a subtle campaign of resistance, spreading rumors and questioning Mark's motives. Mark caught whispers in the break room, coworkers implying he was exaggerating or stirring trouble. It stung, but Mark refused to react. Instead, he focused on his work, finishing reports, preparing presentations, and rebuilding trust with clients. At one point, Amy called him during a break. "How are you?" she asked gently. "Trying to keep my head above water," Mark admitted. "Feels like a battle." "I'm here for you," Amy said. "Remember that." That evening, Mark sat alone in his apartment, staring at his laptop. The quiet weighed heavily, but he pushed himself to write an email to the executive board outlining everything he had experienced, the impact on the team, and suggestions for a healthier workplace culture. He hesitated before hitting send, heart pounding. Then, with a decisive click, it was done. Days passed without a response. The silence gnawed at him. Then, unexpectedly, Mark was invited to meet with the CEO, the man who had hired James. Mark's nerves flared as he entered the sleek glass office. The CEO looked up from his desk, a serious expression on his face. "I've read your email," he said bluntly. "And I want to thank you for your honesty." Mark blinked in surprise. "We're implementing new policies," the CEO continued. "More transparency, better support. No one should feel bullied here." Mark allowed himself a small smile. "This company should be a place where people can thrive, not fear," the CEO added. Mark left the meeting feeling a cautious hope. But the scars remained. Later that week, Mark noticed an email from James sitting in his inbox, a short message, "You haven't heard the last of me." Mark deleted it without a second thought. He was done being afraid. The office buzzed with a cautious energy. After weeks of tension, things were beginning to shift. The new policies announced by the CEO had started to take root, anonymous reporting systems were in place, management training scheduled, and clear guidelines on workplace conduct distributed. Mark felt the weight of those small changes. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was progress. He arrived early, coffee in hand, and found a quiet corner near the window. The morning sun filtered softly through the blinds, casting a warm glow over his desk. He opened his laptop and typed a message to Lisa. "Thank you for sticking by me. This fight's been harder than I ever imagined." Her quick reply came, "You're stronger than you know. We'll get through this." Mark smiled. He glanced around the office. Some faces that had once avoided his gaze now offered tentative smiles. Others still kept their distance. Old wounds take time to heal. As he settled into his work, a knock came at his door. Karen stepped in, holding a folder. "The board reviewed your suggestions," she said, voice low but firm. "They want you to help lead the new diversity and inclusion task force." Mark blinked, surprised. "You want me to be a leader in this?" he asked cautiously. Karen nodded. "Your experience makes you the perfect person." For the first time in a long while, Mark felt a flicker of pride. This means a lot," he admitted. Karen smiled. "You deserve it." The weeks that followed were challenging but rewarding. Mark worked with HR and other employees to create workshops, support groups, and clear channels for reporting issues. He spoke openly about his experience, encouraging others to share their stories. But the road wasn't smooth. Some colleagues resisted. Old habits die hard. Gossip still circulated, and occasional cold shoulders reminded Mark that trust had to be rebuilt piece by piece. One afternoon, Mark found an envelope on his desk. Inside was a simple note, unsigned. "You made me look bad. Watch your back." Mark's heart sank. The threat was clear. He didn't respond. Instead, he forwarded the note to security and HR. A meeting was called. The company doubled efforts to protect employees from harassment. Mark took a deep breath. Fear still lingered, but it no longer ruled him. Outside the office window, the city moved on, indifferent, busy, unaware of the quiet battles inside glass walls. Mark realized the fight was far from over. But now he wasn't alone. He had allies. He had hope. And above all, he had his own voice. One evening, as Mark walked home, he stopped beneath a street lamp. He looked up at the stars, silent witnesses to his journey. The darkness hadn't disappeared, but neither had the light. He knew that sometimes the hardest battles bring the deepest growth. And sometimes surviving meant finding the strength to stand tall even when the world seemed against you. Mark smiled softly and continued walking, ready for whatever came next.